Hey everyone. Welcome back to HOA Karen Stories. Before we dive into today's incredible story, I want to take just 1 second to ask for your support. If you enjoy this content, and want to see more stories about crazy HOA drama, hit that subscribe button. It takes just a second, but it really helps fuel my passion and keeps me creating more for you. Thanks so much. Now let's get into today's story. The sun was low on the horizon as I pulled into the driveway of my family's estate. The scent of fresh earth and the sound of distant birdsong filling the air. But as I neared the front of the property, something felt off. My heart skipped a beat. My gaze snapped to the land where my family's garden used to flourish. Instead of the lush greenery and vibrant flowers, there was a massive construction site. Bright yellow bulldozers and cranes towered over the area, their mechanical jaws digging into the soil that had once supported our crops. A large construction crew buzzed around, all wearing hard hats and safety vests. But it wasn't the noise of the machinery that made my blood run cold, it was the sight of what they were building. A massive swimming pool, its blue tiles already beginning to take shape, stretched across what had once been our peaceful garden. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Someone had started building without my permission. My stomach churned as I looked around, desperate for an explanation. The workers paid no attention to me, busy with their tasks. I stepped out of my car, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, each step making the tension in my chest grow heavier. This wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was a deliberate violation. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and I pulled it out of my pocket. A text from Sarah, my wife, flashed across the screen. Richard, something's wrong. Call me now. I marched toward the construction site, my heart pounding with each step. The workers barely glanced up as I approached, their focus entirely on the task at hand. But I wasn't looking for them, I was searching for Karen. She had to be behind this. I spotted her almost immediately, standing just beyond the barricades, clipboard in hand. Her designer sunglasses shielded her eyes, but I could see the smugness in her posture, her confidence in the unfolding project. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was Karen Reynolds, the HOA president who'd always seen my family's land as a nuisance. And now, she was bulldozing her way through it. Karen? I called, my voice steady but brimming with anger. She turned, her lips curling into a tight, almost mocking smile. Richard, I'm so glad you could make it, she said, almost too sweetly, as if nothing was wrong. We're just doing a little community upgrade here. You should be grateful. It's for the betterment of the neighborhood. I clenched my fists. This is my land. You have no right to do this. Where's the permission to build here? Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Oh, Richard. The HOA approved everything. You must have missed the notices. The community agreed. She waved her hand dismissively as if brushing off my concerns. I stepped forward, my voice growing firmer. I didn't miss anything. Karen? This is my property, and I want proof that you have any legal right to build here. For a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she quickly reached for her phone. I'll call the authorities, she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. You're obstructing construction, and I won't tolerate this kind of behavior. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up, its siren faintly echoing across the property. The officer stepped out. And I froze. He was familiar, too familiar. It was Dave. My old neighbor. He had worked with my father for years. And he'd always been a fair, level-headed guy. His expression softened when he saw me. And he quickly walked over, ignoring Karen's flustered protests. "Everything okay here, Richard?" he asked, giving me a nod of recognition. I glanced at Karen, then back at Dave. "I'm fine. But I'm sure Karen here has a lot of explaining to do." Karen's face twisted in frustration, realizing her attempt to use the police against me was failing. Dave raised an eyebrow at her, clearly seeing through the act. "Karen? You know you can't just build on private land without permission. We'll need to sort this out properly." Her confident mask shattered. And for the first time, I saw her squirm. It was clear she didn't have the legal standing she thought she did. And with Dave here, I knew the tables were turning. After the confrontation with Karen, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple fight. She had underestimated me before. But this time, I was ready. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table. Papers sprawled out in front of me, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. Sarah sat across from me, quietly making notes. Her presence grounded me. But I couldn't shake the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. I had to get to the bottom of this, and I needed proof. I started with the old property records, carefully pulling out maps and deeds from the files my grandfather had kept over the years. His meticulous organization had always seemed unnecessary. But now I was thankful for every single document. As I sifted through the papers, I noticed something odd. The land where the pool was being built had never been officially zoned for community use. According to the official county records, the property was clearly marked as privately owned, my family's land. There were no zoning permits, no development approvals for this type of construction. The HOA had no legal right to touch it. The realization hit me hard. Karen had been using her position to manipulate the system. I pulled out a series of old building permits, each stamped with the county's seal. But all of them were outdated or had been manipulated in ways that didn't make sense. I dug deeper, checking through emails, old contracts, and meeting minutes. And that's when I found it, the thread that would unravel everything. In one email exchange, Karen was speaking directly with local contractors, instructing them to bypass the standard zoning processes and find a way around the legal barriers. Another email, dated just a few weeks ago, was a conversation between Karen and a developer about securing the land for community development. It became clear that this was more than just a poorly handled project, it was part of a long-standing pattern. Over the years, Karen had manipulated zoning laws, used her power to silence objections, and orchestrated illegal land grabs under the guise of community improvement. My mind raced as I reviewed the documents. This wasn't just about a swimming pool anymore, it was about Karen's calculated scheme to expand her control over the entire neighborhood, using the HOA as her personal tool. I needed to expose this. But I had to be careful. If I went public too soon, she could bury this evidence, destroy the credibility of the witnesses, and discredit everything. But I had enough now to make a solid case. And I wasn't backing down. Sarah and I spent the night scanning documents, carefully preserving everything. The next day, I'd meet with Marcus, my lawyer. This fight was only just beginning. But with these pieces of the puzzle, I felt ready to face Karen head-on. The evening of the community meeting arrived. And the air was thick with anticipation. I stood outside the town hall, watching people trickle in. Some faces were familiar. Others were new. But all of them shared a quiet tension. A sense that something wasn't right. It was the kind of small-town gathering where the unspoken rules had always been to stay silent and compliant. Especially when it came to Karen and the HOA. For years, Karen had held the reins tightly, steering the community in whatever direction suited her. But tonight, I was determined to change that. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was charged with a nervous energy. The long wooden table at the front of the room was surrounded by HOA board members, all sitting in their usual spots. Karen, of course, was front and center, her perfectly pressed blazer glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking every bit the image of control she so desperately clung to. As the room filled, whispers echoed. People hesitant to speak their minds, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension. I stood at the back, my heart pounding, knowing that what I was about to reveal would change everything. The moment the meeting began, Karen wasted no time, launching into her usual spiel about community progress and how the new pool would be an asset to everyone. Her voice was as sweet as ever. But now there was a hint of something more sinister beneath it, nervousness. When it was finally my turn, I walked to the front of the room, my documents neatly stacked and ready. The silence was palpable as I began to speak. Each word deliberate, measured. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight to present something that you need to see. This is not just about a pool. This is about what's been happening behind closed doors. And how the HOA has been taking advantage of us for years. I laid the property maps, emails, and old zoning documents out on the table in front of them. Each one revealing a piece of the story Karen had tried so hard to bury. Karen Reynolds and the HOA, I continued, have been systematically manipulating zoning laws, using their power to push through developments like this pool, all without proper legal approval. This land, the land where this pool is being built, has been in my family for generations. It is private property, and the construction happening here is illegal. A murmur ran through the room. At first, it was quiet, hesitant. But then the voices grew louder. The people who had once stayed silent, who had lived in fear of Karen's wrath, now felt emboldened. They began to question what they had been told. The stories Karen had spun to make them think she was doing what was best for the community. The whispers turned into full conversations. Karen's face grew tight, her hands gripping the edge of the table as her usual air of authority began to crumble. This is nothing but a disruption, she said, trying to maintain control. We have rules, and these documents don't mean anything. We follow all procedures. But no one was listening. I could see it in their eyes. The trust was gone. The community had seen Karen for what she was, a manipulator who cared more about power than about the well-being of the people she was supposed to serve. One by one, people began to rise from their seats, walking up to the table to sign the petition to halt the construction. Martha Thompson, a long-time resident who had always been fair-minded but quiet, stepped forward. "I've lived here for years," she said, her voice steady but strong. "And I've seen things I didn't like. But I stayed silent. Not anymore. This is wrong." As she signed the petition, others followed suit. And soon the room was filled with the sound of pens on paper. The symbol of a community finally coming together to stand up for what was right. Even some of the board members, who had once sided with Karen, looked uneasy. Karen, realizing her grip on the room was slipping, tried one last time to control the narrative. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You don't know the full story. You don't understand the bigger picture." But the community had heard enough. The whispers were now questions, doubts, and calls for action. The tide was turning. And Karen could feel it. As I looked around, I saw it, the beginning of a shift. The first real challenge to her power. And I knew, with certainty, that the fight was just beginning. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. I could feel the weight of the past few months pressing down on my shoulders. The long nights spent gathering evidence. The sleepless hours spent preparing for this moment. I sat at the defense table with Marcus, my lawyer, who had become more than just a legal expert in these past weeks. He had become a trusted ally, helping me navigate this intricate battle against Karen and the HOA. On the other side of the room, Karen sat with her lawyer. Her usual air of confidence gone, replaced by a tense and nervous energy that she couldn't mask. The trial had been underway for days. But today was the final showdown. Our evidence was irrefutable: property records, old building permits, email exchanges, and witness testimonies had all painted a clear picture of Karen's manipulation. Every document we presented was a strike against her carefully constructed facade. Marcus stood, addressing the judge, his voice calm but powerful. "Your Honor," he began, "what we have here is not a simple case of a community development project gone wrong. This is a deliberate and systematic abuse of power. The defendant, Ms. Karen Reynolds, used her position as HOA president to bypass zoning laws, manipulate permits, and illegally seize land that was never rightfully hers." I could feel Karen's eyes burning into me from across the room. But I refused to let her intimidation tactics get to me. This was bigger than her. It was about justice for my family and the community. Marcus continued, methodically dismantling Karen's defense. He exposed the fraudulent permits, false claims of zoning approval, and her history of using underhanded tactics to secure land for personal gain. When it came time for Karen to speak, her voice was shaky, her carefully rehearsed defense unraveling before her eyes. "This pool, it was for the community," she said, her tone desperate. "We followed all procedures. The permits are valid. But the evidence was overwhelming." Marcus presented the emails showing her direct communication with contractors, instructing them to proceed with construction despite knowing that the land wasn't properly zoned. "You knew the permits were not legitimate," Marcus said, his voice steady. "You knew the land wasn't zoned for this. But you pushed forward anyway." Karen's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Ms. Reynolds?" the judge said, her voice sharp. "Do you have anything to refute the evidence presented here today?" Karen fell silent, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The judge turned to the jury, who had been listening intently to the testimony, their expressions serious and focused. "The court will deliberate," the judge said, before stepping away from the bench. Minutes felt like hours as the courtroom waited for the verdict. Finally, the judge returned, and the room fell into a tense silence. "The court has reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that the HOA, under the leadership of Ms. Karen Reynolds, acted unlawfully. I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Richard Holloway. The construction of the pool on his property is to be halted immediately, and the pool is to be demolished. A wave of relief washed over me as the gavel came down. The judge's ruling was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who had been victimized by Karen's manipulation. The court also ordered a full investigation into Karen's actions, promising that her history of fraudulent land deals would be exposed for everyone to see. The aftermath was swift. Karen's reputation, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The local media jumped on the story, reporting on the illegal land grab and the abuses of power that had gone unchecked for so long. The community that had once lived in fear of Karen began to speak out, sharing their own stories of intimidation and corruption. The real estate deals that Karen had used to expand her influence were now under scrutiny, and several city council members who had been complicit in her schemes resigned, one by one. But the most important change came within the community itself. People began to realize that they didn't have to be afraid of the HOA or its president. They started to stand up for their rights, rallying behind the idea that property ownership meant more than just following rules. It meant preserving the integrity of what you owned and holding others accountable for their actions. As for me, I returned to my family's land, watching as the bulldozers moved away and the earth began to heal. The garden would one day be restored, and my family's legacy would continue. Karen had lost, but the fight for justice had won. And that was a victory for all of us.